All right, welcome to the Cwic Media Come Follow Me series. This episode is 2 Kings 17 to 25. We're going to back up before that, though, and fill in a few historical pieces before we get into chapter 17. We're going to start here and just kind of go through the rundown of the summaries from chapters 8 up until 17 quickly here before we delve into the assigned chapters. So here we can see in chapter 8, Jehoram and then Ahaziah reign in wickedness in Judah. This is, again, I think I brought this up before, but the Old Testament really is a lot like the Jaredite history, and probably like all of history everywhere all the time in terms of iniquity. It just constantly falls into iniquity, and it's a very rare thing to have a righteous king that is going to hold strong and do what is necessary to actually bear that mantle of reigning as a king in righteousness. It's not an easy thing to do. So more iniquity here. Jezebel is killed by Jehu and is eaten by dogs. That is the wife of Ahab. And Ahab's 70 sons are slain. So again, it sounds like the book of Ether here. Chapter 11, Athaliah destroys the royal family in Judah and reigns herself in Judah. Okay. Jehoash or Joash reigns in righteousness. So this one is rare. Joash is slain and Amaziah reigns. So just kind of going through the time here. Jehoahaz and his successors reign in wickedness in Israel. So we're going back and forth again between the two kingdoms, the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, where the 10 tribes are. Elisha dies here in 13:14. Israel defeats Judah in battle. So here's, I just want to understand what's going on here between these two kingdoms. They sometimes are in alliance against foreign foes, and sometimes they are battling each other. Jeroboam reigns in wickedness in Israel. This is not the same Jeroboam originally. This is Jeroboam the second. And in 15, much of Israel is carried captive to Assyria by Tiglath-Pileser. Okay, so first of all here, this is what they used to do. And this is what the Assyrians did, and many other. Babylon is going to do the exact same thing to the southern kingdom of Judah. What they do is they take a number of, usually the elites, the people of the court, of the king's court, the craftsmen and those that have skills, the intellectuals, and these individuals, and they take a number of them and take them into Assyria. And so that's the first step here, and that's a common thing to have happen when you create a vassal state like northern Israel becomes. And but this is not the massive pulling away of the spreading of the 10 tribes yet. This is just a very beginning of this. Then eventually, Ahaz reigns in wickedness in Judah, so going down to the southern kingdom in 16. He offers his son in heathen sacrifice. Again, bad things happening here. He makes a new altar, destroys the brazen sea, baptismal font, and changes the method of sacrificing in the temple. This we need to see often here as something that is leading up to what we're going to see here happen again is changes in the temple. And this is where the core rituals are. This is where the most sacred things are. And here you have Ahaz that is going in and making a number of these ritual changes here in the sacrifices. They've had in the past Baal worshipped in the temple for a long period of time, especially under Ahab and Jezebel in the north. And later on in the intertestamental periods, you're going to have Zeus, actually statue of Zeus, put into the temple of Herod for the Jews for a time being in Jerusalem. Later on, these things happen. They happen from conquering foes, foreigners. They also happen from within as things become corrupted. And that's when you start to see things really corrupt, is when the worshiping changes. the doctrine of the rituals, or the rituals are changed and the doctrine therefore is changed of the religion. And we're going to look out for that here as we go along here. Getting to chapter 17, this is now we're into the assigned chapters here. This is where we get the 10 tribes that are going to be carried away captive by the kings of Assyria. So they come in, they deplete pretty much all those that would be productive and would help form culture. And they pull all of those and they scatter them abroad into the northern countries, as they're called, but also over to the east. And there go the 10 tribes. A number of the Israelites, those 10 tribes, still remain behind, but there are others that Assyria brings into the northern kingdom area of the 10 tribes and populates that area with other Assyrians or those of the Assyrian Empire, and they pretty much demolish the culture. That's how they do it. And so those individuals then, the mixture of that group is what ends up becoming the Samaritans. So Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. The Samaritans then are those that are left over. This happens in 721 BC, where the 10 tribes are scattered. And so you go from 721 and then bring that all the way down to Christ's time. So you're talking about 750 years when you end up with the Samaritans of Jesus' time and the parable of the Good Samaritan. But here, let's dip in here to chapter 17 and go over a couple of things here. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. Again, that's the capital. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, this is the new king now, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. They're a vassal state. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gosan and in the cities of the Medes. This would be Persia, right, in that area, and other areas that would go up into the north. And we get here another thing here. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God. And they built them high places. Again, other times high places in the Old Testament are seen as positive. Here we get this going into the Deuteronomic books here more and more. We get this as being not centralized and therefore shown as being not under the proper priesthood authority, perhaps. Now, that doesn't mean that the high places were not corrupted. They may have been corrupted, and they may have been doing things there in the high places at altars up in the mountains and the hills that were wrong, and idol worshiping and things like that. But there is a strange conflict here that's happening, and as we move into the theme of the Deuteronomists, which we're going into here in this episode more, we can see that there are some issues here in how they're handling what's going on in Israel. In verse 10, we also get, and they set them up images and groves in every high hill. What are the groves? That is Asherah. That is the fertility goddess as well. So again, probably not good, but it could be that this is just a corrupted version of something that is true. We think again about a mother in heaven. How can that become corrupted? Well, very, very easily that can become corrupted. And so you get Asherah, the Canaanite goddess, the Philistine goddess and Canaanite goddess that comes in, and she's the goddess of fertility, essentially. Down here in 16, and they left all the commandments of the Lord their God and made them molten images, even 2 calves, which is interesting, right? That's what they did in Egypt, and made a grove, Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. So this is really important to understand, the host of heaven. Here's what we need to look at here with this. what is happening with the host of heaven? Host of heaven is something that is either viewed negatively or is not mentioned hardly at all in the Deuteronomic books. So why? What does this mean? Well, the host of heaven, as most people will look at this, will be, okay, they're worshiping things that are represented by the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon. And so we get a mythology and an idol worshiping that starts to happen here. But again, when we go through these histories of the gospel, we need to look at how things can be corrupted and what the truth is behind them. For example, how about the term the Lord of hosts? That is a term that is not used. And I don't believe it's used at all, I think, in any of the Deuteronomic books. What does it mean? Why would they not use that? Why is that non-existent there? Well, imagine how something can become corrupted. If there is idol worshiping and people start worshiping all these hosts of heaven, and you have a theology like the Deuteronomists did of a single God without any father and any son, and you want to flatten the hierarchy, so to speak, into one single entity God called Jehovah, and you want to get rid of the premortal life, which is represented in the Holy of Holies, where the council happens, right? The council in heaven happens. That's what the Holy of Holies is. That's where the throne of God is. And we see all of these other temple images and visions from prophets, like in the Book of Mormon. In the very first chapter of Nephi, Lehi has a vision of God on the throne, surrounded by 12, and then surrounded by concourses of angels, hosts of angels that are praising God. So if I have a theology that wants to limit all of that, reduce it all down to one single entity, which also gets rid of Christ, right? It gets rid of the idea of the Son of God coming down to earth and all that was spoken there in the war in heaven and in the plan of salvation offered by our Heavenly Father. Then I could use the excuse of all of this idol worshiping that's going on to get rid of all of that and reduce everything down. That's what it seems like to me that is happening here. There is reason to get rid of these things. You go to someone like a Margaret Barker, a Methodist theologian, and for her it's more cut and dry. It's more black and white. It's the Deuteronomists got rid of things that were good, like the high places and the host of heaven, and they corrupted them and changed them. That's probably true, but there probably were a lot of bad things going on. And because that's how things usually happen. There's an excuse to go in and come in with this hardline change that the Deuteronomists are going to come in with soon. And that they really tried to do, it looks to me like, even in the time of Isaiah. So what else is happening here? Horrible things in verse 17, and they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire. This is with the worship of Moloch, right? It's child sacrifice. This happens in the Book of Mormon too. There was none left but the tribe of Judah, because that's actually Judah and Benjamin. Also, Judah kept not the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel, which they made. So something's happening here from the north that's coming down into the kingdom of Judah. And in verse 23, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants, the prophets. So they prophesied of this happening. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cuthah and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof, right? So that's how you end up with the Samaritans. All right, chapter 18, here we now have Hezekiah coming in. This is during the time of Isaiah, and he reigns in righteousness. I'm not going to cover much of this because we'll cover this more when we get to Isaiah. Remember, what we're doing here is we're going through a period of time where we're going to end up going next week into Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the end of the Old Testament. And then we're going to backtrack quite a bit and then come back through several hundred years again as we go back into the Psalms and Proverbs and Esther during the time of the exile, and then coming all the way back down to the time of Jeremiah, which is during the time of Lehi. But the one thing I want to bring up here in chapter 18 that I think, again, is very important is another change that happens in the temple. And if you listen to this podcast, then you know that we cover this a lot. This is kind of an anchor point for me in understanding what I call the Nehor principle. Verse 4, and this is talking about King Hezekiah. He removed the high places, so he's doing the same thing, and break the images, the idols, and cut down the groves, Asherah, and break in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense unto it, and he called it Nehushtan, which is probably a pejorative. Yeah, that is a combination of a play on words of both serpent and copper or bronze. And so what's happening here? Think about what the brazen serpent is. Who does the brazen serpent represent? The brazen serpent represents Jesus Christ. This was likely in the temple. So what are you doing getting rid of an image that Moses himself used that represents Jesus Christ, the healer, right? Highland. What are they doing? Why does this happen? Well, there's two different options here that I see. One is that Hezekiah may not be all on board here in righteousness when this happens. And the priests want to get rid of it. And they're corrupted. And they decide, hey, we're going to get rid of this. This doesn't fall into our plans, our theological plans. This is happening in Judah, and the Deuteronomists may already start to have some effect on the religion here in Judah. And the Deuteronomists do not want anything that represents a son of God or an atoner. And so here you have the brazen serpent. Well, that's exactly what that represents. Now, why would I say that that's a possibility? I would say that's a possibility because if you go through the Book of Mormon, even though we don't get in specific terms Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, we get some a little bit, we get some allusions to this by some of the prophets, Zechariah and Malachi and Isaiah especially. But in the Book of Mormon, it's very clear what happens. The doctrine of Christ and the foretelling of him coming down to earth and lowering himself below us in birth, in baptism, and in death in Gethsemane is always what is pulled away from the religion. It's always pulled away. So why wouldn't it be happening here? There is a natural man course to diminish, to dilute, to remove the doctrine of Christ. And so as I see this could be happening at the high level, right, within the temple itself and among the priests. We know the priests become corrupt in the time of Jeremiah 100 years later. So it's not like it doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened before. We've seen them worship Baal in the north, in the temple. This is not out of the question. The other option is it happens exactly as they say it does, where you have the children of Israel burning incense to it. Well, so what would be happening then? Well, maybe the priests are holding strong, and King Hezekiah is righteous and holding strong at this point, but the people are corrupted with the doctrine of Christ. And they're turning it into something else. And the way I would look at this is the Garden of Eden. Who does Satan say he is? He says, I am the God of this world. And who is he? He is the serpent. So it's kind of like a play on, I am the Christ. I am the God. I am the brazen serpent. And that's something I think we need to consider as to how this would align with something that is already theologically foundational to the Old Testament religion. But regardless of how it happens, the image of the healer, the image of the atoner, the image of the most important part of the gospel is removed. And what does it say he does? He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. Okay, again, I just wonder, that's tied directly to removing the brazen serpent. In my mind, I have to wonder about that. And because that's exactly what they say about King Josiah, and that is, it's very suspicious when we get to Josiah here in a few minutes, that he was the greatest king. It's possible, but it's very suspicious. All right, into chapter 19. Hezekiah seeks counsel from Isaiah, again, very common in war, to save Jerusalem from whom? Well, now that the Assyrians have taken the northern kingdom, a couple decades later, they come after Judah, the kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah, where Isaiah, and this is now the time of Hezekiah at this point. And what happens with them? Well, Isaiah prophesies that the Assyrians will be destroyed and that a remnant of Judah will flourish. An angel slays 185,000 Assyrians. Sennacherib is slain by his sons. Okay, so they're surrounded. They are besieged by the Assyrians in Jerusalem, and they hold off from them, right? They hold them off, and Assyria does not end up conquering the kingdom of Judah. They battle and they get a couple of the cities, but they do not end up with Jerusalem, and eventually 185,000 Assyrians die. We don't know how exactly that happens. It says an angel slays them. How did an angel slay them? A couple things to consider. Well, something to consider here is possibly the plague. That's a very real possibility that this would have been a problem for them back in that time. But here we get a little bit of a connection here with Hezekiah and Isaiah working together. And again, we're going to get more into that as we get into the book of Isaiah. In chapter 20 here, I'm going to bring this also up a little bit more in Isaiah, but we're going to just plant a little seed here. Hezekiah is told he will die and pleads with the Lord. His life is lengthened 15 years. Isaiah prophesies the Babylonian captivity of Judah. So now the southern kingdom prophets are going to be saying that Judah is going to be taken captive because they're wicked. They already see this. They already know that this is what's going to happen here. Some of what happens here with Hezekiah, I just want to say, I think that part of this is ritual. And I think it's temple ritual. So he's going to die. He's told, he's healed, and then told he's going to live 15 years more. We're going to see a little bit of this maybe in the suffering servant songs of Isaiah in that book. And we need to consider ritual in these things. We need to consider that this is what you do when you're a righteous king and you're following through on the temple drama. That there are rituals that are going to be followed where you represent the temporal king as the king, and you're going to represent Jehovah as the king. So in other words, you are, as a king, a suffering servant. But the suffering servant, who you're trying to emulate and represent as the temporal king, the King of Kings, is the suffering servant. And we see this theme play out beautifully with King Benjamin. What is his focus on that? It is about being a servant to the people. Why is that there? I believe that is ritual. I think he's playing into the temple ritual of the suffering servant. And that theme that Isaiah goes over at least 4, possibly 5 times in his books. And then we get here Manasseh. Manasseh is going to be the grandfather to Josiah. He is wicked. Other books actually have him killing, impaling, or even cutting in half Isaiah. Not doctrine, but interesting. More prophets foretell the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. Wickedness continues under Ammon, who is the son of Manasseh. Ammon is going to be Josiah's father. So you have Manasseh, extremely wicked, Ammon, wicked, and then you're going to get this kid named Josiah, who's placed on the throne when he's 8 years old. And we see even with Manasseh, he is on the throne at 12 years old, the grandfather of Josiah. So at 12 years old, who is really running the country? Who is really running who is really over the priests even, and the temple and the theocracy that exists there? Those are, who's around him? Who's in charge? And then we finally get to chapter 22 here, which is Josiah. And here's where I want to bring in more about the Deuteronomists. Remember, the Deuteronomists, and I'm going to put a link in the description on YouTube here about more about the Deuteronomists in the Book of Mormon, because I think we could see definitely a heritage of Laman and Lemuel as following the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic theology. And that's what they represent, as opposed to the theology of the doctrine of Christ, which is what we get with Lehi and Nephi. But the Deuteronomists are a group that likely comes from the northern kingdom. As I said, I believe they're already infecting the religion of Judah, of the southern kingdom in Jerusalem and at the temple in the time of Isaiah. And what they're doing is they're flattening everything. They're removing everything. Their idea is we're going to consolidate all of the hosts of heaven, which also, I believe, this is just me, means that they're going to get rid of any kind of pluralistic idea of heaven with other individuals than just one single God, which is what we get with most of Christianity today. Although they do believe in angels, but where do the angels come from? Who are they? They're not us in their sight. But it's going to consolidate everything down to a single Jehovah, right? Monotheism in its extreme. The other thing it does then, by doing this, you're going to remove, remember the Holy of Holies and the temple have got other individuals in the area, on the veil, probably on the walls, where you have stars, and you do have moons, and the moon, and you do have the sun, because these represent the hosts of heaven, but not in a negative sense. Think about the temple in Salt Lake, where you have the sun and the moon and the stars and others. There's Saturn and others that are up there. Do we worship those? No. But there's a representation of creation and pluralism that goes beyond just God, right? And you have the hosts of heaven and Jesus as the Lord of hosts. And so they want to remove all of this and break it down and bring it all the way down to just a Jehovah. He is both Father and Son. He is a single entity with nothing around him, unlike what we get with the visions in Christianity in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, and then also in the Book of Mormon. So they've taken charge now, it appears. And with Josiah, they seem to have really fully taken charge at this point. And the other thing that they're doing is they're politically, they are getting rid of all of the high places and all of the groves, and fine, maybe there's a lot of idolatry going on there, but what they do is they consolidate power into one central place only, and that's in Jerusalem, so that they have complete control over this. And this seems to be what Jesus confronts when he is in his mortal life. And it is exactly what happens with Lehi in Jerusalem. He is preaching against these things. He's preaching about Jesus Christ. And you have these Deuteronomistic reforms that have taken place in Lehi's time. Josiah here is just, maybe, I can't remember the exact number, I want to say about 20 years before Lehi is going to leave. Maybe a little bit longer, 20, 30 years before Lehi is going to leave Jerusalem. And this is what he's fighting against. And here Josiah is going to be put on the throne when he's 8 years old. The same question goes here. Who is really running things? He seems to have allies here that are really in charge that could be called the people of the land, which would be like the lords, right? The landowners. And they may be allies and converted to this kind of as elitists. They're kind of converted to this new religion of the Deuteronomists. And this is where we get in verse 8, and Hilkiah, the high priest, said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Well, a lot of biblical scholars will say that this is the book of Deuteronomy, or at least a version of the book of Deuteronomy, and that didn't exist before. As Latter-day Saints, we believe in the book of Deuteronomy, that it is inspired, because we find it in the Book of Mormon. And you know what? Christ actually refers to it several times in the New Testament. So I don't think we can say that this is the book of a brand new book that is found here. I think that this is a new version of the book of Deuteronomy, maybe even more, maybe even all of the Deuteronomic books, going all the way back to Joshua and coming up into Jeremiah. There are changes in there. There's a different type of writing, a different style, and there's a different focus on concentrating everything into one single Jerusalem power and consolidating all heavenly hierarchy, flattening that hierarchy down into a single Jehovah. And so that's the question that you have to have at this point is was Josiah really righteous? Or did the victors write the book here and put him up as being righteous? He may have been righteous, maybe above all odds, like a Joseph Smith figure in his youth. He is fighting off all of the wickedness around him, and he has the right mentors, etc. The problem with that is that over a short period of time, after finding the book here and making all of the reforms that Josiah makes, which are the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic reforms, you end up with Lehi's Jerusalem, which is unbelievably wicked and ripe for captivity by the Babylonians. So what led up to that? Right? What led up to Lehi's Jerusalem? What led up to Lehi's Jerusalem where they want to kill him for preaching about Jesus Christ? That's why they're going to kill him. Read 1 Nephi 1 carefully. It's not just because they're being bad boys and girls and he wants them to repent. They have given up on the doctrine of Christ. This is why we get the vision of Lehi with Christ and the 12 and the concourses of angels around him in the very first chapter of the Book of Mormon. It is a response to Lehi's Jerusalem. And that's what launches the Book of Mormon. So they make all of these changes. They're going to go in and they reread the books in front of everybody at the temple. It's a they make these new covenants. Something changes big here. Why all of a sudden? Why can't they use the previous books? Were the previous books wrong? All of a sudden they have a law and they have a new law and they have to change everything. It's very suspicious. Very, very suspicious. In chapter 24, Jerusalem is besieged and taken by Nebuchadnezzar. So they become a vassal state to to Babylon, to King Nebuchadnezzar. They take away a number of the elites, just like they did with Assyria the first time around. So they're going to go in and they're going to take away a lot of the king's court. They're going to take away the intellectuals. They're going to take away the craftsmen, those that have certain skills that can be used elsewhere in Babylon and in their empire, and they're going to put them in other places. This is likely where we get Daniel and maybe Ezekiel taken away at this point. And so Daniel and Ezekiel their books happen in Babylon because they're taken away here in the first removal of some of the members of the kingdom of Judah. And then in chapter 25, the whole thing happens here, right? You've got, in chapter 24, you have King Nebuchadnezzar putting Zedekiah on the throne. So King Nebuchadnezzar ends up putting Zedekiah on the throne in 597 BC, as far as historians will tell you. That's probably right. And in that very first year that Zedekiah is on the throne, that's when Lehi leaves Jerusalem. He knows what's going to happen. And Zedekiah is in a position where he has to choose between Egypt and Babylon, these two powers. Even though he was put on by Babylon, he's going to turn several years later, 11 years later after he's put on the throne. He's going to have decided to go with Egypt instead, and that's when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys in 586 BC. Comes in and destroys Jerusalem and the temple and everything else, right? And takes away a number of, not all, but a number of the Jews in Judah back to Babylon. So this is really, it's an axial moment for the scriptures and for the gospel, because this is the time of Lehi, and this is what launches the Book of Mormon. And it is a response to the Deuteronomistic reforms and changes that are happening here in Jerusalem. I highly recommend that you go into the link that I'm going to put in the description box on YouTube, because it's going to tie together what's happening with Jeremiah and Jerusalem with what happens with Lehi and Nephi at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. And when you can see things in that light, wow, it just really brings to life the Book of Mormon and an understanding of why it is another testament of Jesus Christ. It's not just because. It's a response. It's a response to what's happening in Jerusalem. I'll talk to you next time.